Don Airey, a name rarely found on posters or basking in the spotlight, yet the sound he created has echoed through half a century of British rock. He was never the soul of a TV show nor the face splashed across newspapers. He was the musician behind the moments that left the world breathless. From the explosive roar of a Hammond organ that ignited a concert night, to the hidden chords that held an entire melody together, Don became the man who made other people's music shine, even when that light scarcely touched him. But that is only the visible part of a journey that spans nearly a lifetime. Behind every blazing performance was a quiet soul from Sunderland, carrying the chill of childhood rehearsals and the unspoken hopes of his family. He has watched friends fall, stood beside legends at their brightest and at their bleakest, and chosen silence in a world addicted to noise, precision in an era constantly slipping out of order. Don Airey never set out to become a legend. He safeguarded the soul of music. And the question that lingers is not about fame at all. Can a life spent behind the spotlight still warm the heart of a man who helped shape rock history when he rarely allowed anyone to truly see him? He entered this world as Donald Smith Airey, born on June 21, 1948, in Sunderland, a windswept seaside town in the northeast of England. In the modest Airey household, music existed like an ember that never went out. His father, Norman Airey, a man who spent many years of his life at the keyboard, infused the home with something unique: perseverance, discipline, and the belief that sound, if touched at the right moment, could become a person's private language. From these lessons that were never explicitly taught, a musical seed quietly took root inside Don, a seed that would carry him into more than half a century of British rock. The old piano standing in the corner of the house was there even before Don was tall enough to reach the keys, and it became his very first friend. There was no grand anecdote marking this beginning, only the afternoons of a curious child placing his fingers on cold keys, listening to the notes ring out, and feeling them cling to his mind like something magical. By the age of 7, Don began studying classical piano, entering a discipline that demanded absolute focus and a seriousness he would only fully grasp later. Music was no longer just a pastime. It became the thread connecting Don to the world, a reminder that responsibility and passion sometimes must travel together. From those early days listening to his father play old tunes, Don started finding his own pulse, tinkering with melodies that had no shape yet somehow appeared in his head. In a house where both parents were musicians, there was always someone practicing, correcting a phrase, or fixing a note. Don absorbed that soundscape the way a child absorbs its surroundings, instinctively. Perhaps that was the greatest gift of his childhood. Not glory, but a foundation strong enough for him to survive the chaos of a musician's life without losing himself. Years later, when recalling his childhood, Don laughed and said music caused his parents headaches not only because of the noise, but because of the electricity. One winter afternoon in 1960, young Don brought home a homemade amplifier so small it looked like a toy. Yet he was determined to see if it could produce a sustained tone like a clock that wouldn't stop ticking. The result: the fuse blew. The entire house went dark. His mother panicked, thinking someone had cut the power, and his father tried not to laugh so the boy wouldn't feel embarrassed. From that night on, Don was banned from bringing anything with a power cord into the living room, a rule he broke 3 days later. Years afterwards, he would joke, "I think that was the first time my music really had destructive power." When he left Sunderland, Don carried little more than an unwavering love for music. At the University of Nottingham, he studied and graduated in music, treating it as a necessary step rather than a destination. He then entered the far stricter environment of the Royal Northern College of Music, where he trained under Richard Bakst, the teacher who shaped the precision and discipline that later defined his style. During this period, Don began to sense the thin line between theory and emotion, structure and freedom, classical music, and the other sounds growing inside him. Something beyond those halls was calling him, something wider than anything he had known. Upon graduating, Don faced the familiar question haunting young musicians. Where do you begin when every path ahead is foggy? He accepted a job performing on P&O cruise ships, spending nearly a year traveling around the world. No grand stage, no spotlight, only waves, ever-changing performance halls, and nights spent adapting himself to each new space. Many saw it as a temporary gig, but for Don, it was his third school, one that taught flexibility, adaptability, and the ability to listen with surgical precision. Those voyages didn't just broaden his view of new cultures. They made him aware that he belonged on much larger stages, places that demanded the sensitivity and emotional depth he had been cultivating since childhood. A journey had quietly begun, like a composition waiting for its next movement, and Don, stepping off that ship, still had no idea that the quiet of his early years was merely a launch pad into the loudest world rock music had ever created. From those drifting days aboard the P&O, Don Airey returned to land with a vivid sense that the voyage had only been the prelude of a long symphony. The flexibility he learned from cramped stages, the sensitivity sharpened by nights listening to waves slap the hull. All of it seemed to lead him to an unexpected crossroads. London in the early 1970s, where every sound had a chance to become the voice of an era. In 1971, Don stepped out of his familiar safety zone and headed to London, carrying a small suitcase and a simple conviction that if there was ever a time to test himself, it was now. London, then, was a meeting point for those chasing their own voices, where experimental bands appeared and disappeared within days. For someone trained in classical music like Don, the city was both chaotic and hypnotic, a storm that only the strong could avoid being swept away by. And in that very turbulence, he joined the band led by Cozy Powell, a drummer with one of the fiercest personalities of the era. Hammer, a name that felt like a blow struck against the earth, became the place where Don first truly collided with the world of rock in its formative stage. Playing with Cozy gave him an experience completely different from anything he had learned in music school. Gone were the rules of Bach and the tenderness of Chopin. In their place were speed, energy, and instinct. Don had to learn how to merge with drums that hit like crashing waves, adjusting each accent not just for precision, but for sharpness. Hammer took him through smoke-filled nights, TV appearances, and concert halls where the roaring crowd nearly drowned out the instruments. For Don, this wasn't just a door opening. It was the push that forced him out of his comfort zone and helped him realize that rock wasn't the opposite of his classical training. It was simply another way to tell a story. But it wasn't until 1975, when Don joined Colosseum II, that he found an environment where everything he had ever learned could finally coexist: the discipline of classical music, the freedom of jazz, and the weight of rock. Led by John Heisman, the band gathered musicians who would later become pillars of British music: Gary Moore, Neil Murray, Mike Starrs, and later John Mole. They didn't play to please the masses. They played to push one another to the limits of technique and emotion. The 3 albums they created together never reached mainstream fame, but became treasures to those who understood that jazz rock at the time was a daring journey few had the courage to embark on. During this period, Don learned to listen to a band the way one listens to a living body, recognizing the drum's breathing, the guitar's breadth, the bass's stability, and finding a place for himself as if he had always been there. What made Don special wasn't speed or flashy solos, but his ability to create the foundation that allowed others to shine. He did not stand out in the usual sense. He made the whole band tighter, richer. It was the very role Deep Purple, many years later, would desperately need him to fill. Thanks to the sensitivity honed during his jazz rock years, Don Airey soon became a familiar choice in London studios whenever someone was needed who could fill a track without imposing ego on it. From small recording sessions to meticulous projects, he quietly sat behind his keyboards, layering chords, synths, and passing ideas as if the survival of each song depended on his precision. That quiet persistence slowly pulled him deeper into the world of professional rock, a world where a single studio decision could alter the entire trajectory of a musician's life. Then one day, his name appeared in the credits for Black Sabbath's Never Say Die, 1978. Few saw it as a turning point, but to Don, it was a clear signal that true giants were beginning to notice him. He still remained outside the spotlight, but his silence now carried weight. It was the silence of a musician capable of blending into any context while keeping something uniquely his. Those years acted like a steady force pushing him closer to bigger stages, harsher collisions, and the darker corners every artist eventually faces. All the small steps, experimental bands, long studio nights, felt as if they were quietly guiding him toward an appointment fate had already arranged. And right at the moment when Don reached full maturity as a musician, the invitation from Rainbow arrived. A door opening at exactly the right time, ushering Don Airey into a new chapter where the lights were brighter and the challenges were deeper than anything he had ever known. In 1979, Don Airey officially became a member of Rainbow, a turning point that didn't just redefine his career, but thrust him onto the front line of the rock world. Rainbow didn't operate like a traditional band. It was a project controlled almost entirely by Ritchie Blackmore, a man known for his strictness, unpredictability, and readiness to replace anyone who failed to meet expectations. Don's selection meant he had joined the rare group of musicians capable of interpreting Blackmore's musical intentions, something few ever mastered. Right from his first album with Rainbow, Down to Earth, 1979, Don's imprint permeated the band's sonic universe. Explosive synth lines, vast harmonies, and signature intros opened new spaces for the songs. Though he wasn't in the spotlight, his presence was everywhere. Rainbow's sound became higher, wider, colder, and sharper, exactly the style Blackmore was chasing. Don didn't claim the spotlight. He built the architecture that allowed the spotlight to exist. By Difficult to Cure, 1981, his role had surpassed that of a mere instrumentalist. The synergy between Blackmore and Airey became the central axis shaping the album's sound. Thick keyboard layers, orchestral colors, and his ability to create textures that lifted both vocals and guitar onto the same plane brought Rainbow into a rare balance between technical prowess and mass appeal. Something very few bands sustain for long. The audience didn't see Don at center stage, but they could feel the structures he built beneath every track. From the late 70s to the early 80s, Don Airey ascended into the ranks of Britain's most formidable musicians. He was no longer just a supporting player. He became an essential link in defining the sonic identity of one of the era's most notable bands. His role wasn't just about playing notes. It was about creating space in which music could expand and breathe, a task requiring both technical sensitivity and a depth of knowledge few possessed. Yet Rainbow's brilliant glow carried an uneasy omen, a sense that far greater trials lay ahead. Don was about to enter a chapter filled with searing rock, devastating upheavals, and milestones so profound that he would later admit They were among the most defining experiences of his artistic life. Leaving Rainbow, Don Airey did not fall into a lull the way many musicians do after a major milestone. On the contrary, he was almost immediately pulled into the orbit of an entirely different universe. One where dazzling light and brutal darkness existed side by side, inseparable. It was the world of Ozzy Osbourne, a world that would throw Don into years of turbulence so intense it would alter not only his career, but his entire view of life. If Rainbow had been a universe of control and structure, Ozzy was a storm, a place where limits were tested and shattered constantly. When Don joined Ozzy's band, the singer was at his most triumphant point after leaving Black Sabbath, yet simultaneously spiraling into a chaotic era fueled by alcohol and drugs. Don later recalled that those years felt like living in two parallel realities. The music glowed bright, but the backstage environment was filled with moments where no one knew what might happen next. Amid this seemingly unstable world, Don became the anchor of musical structure. He played a vital role in albums like Bark at the Moon and Speak of the Devil, shaping the atmospheric keyboard textures that rock historians would eventually identify as a defining part of Ozzy's golden era sound. He even took part in the Diary of a Madman tour, performing on nights where the stage energy felt as though it could explode at any second. Figuratively and almost literally. But that journey also left Don with a memory drenched in tragedy, one he would never escape. One morning in 1982, he stepped off the tour bus to get some fresh air after a long haul. Overhead, a small aircraft swooped recklessly, the pilot seemingly treating it as a daredevil prank. The engine screamed as it dove low, so low that the blast of hot air lifted the hem of Don's coat. A heartbeat later, the ground trembled. In the distance, a thin white plume rose sharply into the sky, slicing the air like a blade. Don stood frozen, one hand still on the door of the bus. People ran in every direction, screams overlapping. But to Don, there was only silence, a void where the plane had vanished. When someone whispered that Randy was on board, Don said nothing. He stepped back, each movement heavy, as if the earth beneath him might give way. That image stayed with him for decades, so much so that even years later, whenever Randy Rhoads' name surfaced, Don would inhale slowly, as though that morning still lived somewhere inside his chest. Randy's death did more than throw the band into crisis. It etched into Don a visceral sense of how fragile musicians are, no matter how loud the music becomes. Even so, he remained with Ozzy for 2 more years. Not because it was safe, it never was, but because someone had to keep the music from falling apart. Don became a stabilizing force during a period when Ozzy was battling himself more fiercely than any audience ever saw. The concerts blazed with intensity, yet life behind the scenes resembled a labyrinth with no exit. Don once said it felt like watching a man soar to heights few could imagine, while being dragged downward by forces he couldn't control. An agonizing paradox that forced the entire band to find balance day after day. Don never judged. He simply bore witness and kept playing, as if music were the only thing holding everyone together. In 1984, his journey with Ozzy came to an end. Not through conflict, but because Don had walked every mile that chapter intended for him. Those years left behind a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in contributing to heavy metal's most explosive era. Gratitude toward the music that kept him grounded in chaos, and a quiet sorrow for the memories he would carry forever. He had seen artists who seemed invincible confront shadows far darker than fame could reveal. A lesson that made Don quieter, wiser, and aware that every note he played held someone's story inside it. From that chaos, he stepped back toward the thing that had sustained him since childhood, pure music, a place where even a single note could be enough to keep balance. A few years of freelance studio work passed, and then 1987 emerged like a clear landmark, a signal that Don Airey was stepping back toward the big stages. The first door to open was Jethro Tull. The band was preparing for the Crest of a Knave tour, an album no one yet knew would later become the most controversial Grammy winner in rock history. Don joined the lineup carrying both the experience and discipline of his classical training. On stage, his Hammond and synth lines intertwined with Ian Anderson's flute, forming a unique harmonic fabric that only Jethro Tull could conjure. For Don, this chapter felt like a breath, a pause after the storms of Rainbow and Ozzy, not loud, not tense, but slow-paced, full of storytelling, like a river he could simply let himself drift along. But that calm was only temporary. Later that same year came another invitation, this time from Whitesnake, who were finishing the album that would become a global phenomenon. Don stepped into the studio sessions for Whitesnake, 1987, and contributed keyboard layers stamped with the unmistakable stadium rock aura, a sound sturdy enough to lift both vocals and guitars, helping the album reach multi-platinum status across several countries. He wasn't the face in the spotlight, but he was embedded in the architecture of the sound, from deep expansive pads to subtle emotional cues beneath the ballads to the carefully carved spaces that allowed the guitars to strike precisely when needed. Working with Jethro Tull and Whitesnake in the same year revealed what defined Don Airey: the ability to move among musical worlds that seemed impossible to reconcile, yet never losing his own identity. Within months, he could sink fully into Jethro Tull's intricate progressive folk and then pivot seamlessly into the grandeur of mainstream rock with Whitesnake. It happened so naturally that few recognized it as an exceptional talent, though in truth, almost no musician on earth could shift styles so fluently. And as if every road he had taken was leading to this, 1988 became the year Don claimed his own voice. His debut solo album, K2, Tales of Triumph and Tragedy. Nearly 40 years old, he finally released a work bearing his own name, quiet, yet weighty. K2 was not made to conquer charts. It was more like a rock cantata, telling the tragic tale of the K2 expedition, the mountain known as the Killer of Climbers. Don did not choose glory or predictable victory. He chose fragility, human limits, and the fierce resolve of those who step into places where a single mistake means eternity. In many ways, the K2 narrative echoed Don's own journey. Losses that defy language, and moments balanced precariously between triumph and pain. The album brought together his closest allies: Gary Moore, Cozy Powell, Keith Airey, and other musicians who understood how Don told stories through sound. K2 carried the spirit of a concept album, not a collection of songs, but a continuous flow, like a film formed entirely from music. To Don, this was not a personal manifesto, but the long exhale of an artist who had endured too many storms, using sound to preserve memories that words could not contain. Quiet as it was, the album became a major milestone. The first time the world heard a voice that belonged entirely to him. When K2 closed that private chapter, Don stood at the threshold of a new era. There was no blazing announcement, only a subtle sense that life's current was carrying him toward a different sonic landscape. From 1988 onward, the colors of the 1990s began to call, offering encounters he hadn't foreseen, experiments he hadn't attempted, and crossroads he'd never stepped across. The 1990s unfolded before Don like a wider territory, no longer defined by storms that swallowed everything, but by winding paths he would have to navigate alone. This was not the era of a single band. It was the journey of an artist discovering himself across ever-shifting sounds, where each project, each tour, felt like opening another door inside the house called his career. Entering a new decade, Don continued the rhythm of life as one of Britain's premier session musicians, the kind of player bands called upon when they needed a subtle harmonic layer or a sonic foundation deep enough to carry the emotional weight of an entire song. It was in that context that he contributed to Painkiller, 1990, by Judas Priest, an album the rock world would later hail as the blueprint of modern heavy metal. Don never stood at the front, never appeared on stage every night, yet his fingerprints are embedded in A Touch of Evil, one of Priest's darkest and most powerful tracks. Years later, he revealed that he played most of the bass synth parts on the album because a member of Judas Priest was unable to attend the session, a little-known detail that perfectly illustrates Don's persistent, invisible role in British rock. That same year, Don toured with Anthem, the Japanese heavy metal outfit, traveling across numerous cities. These journeys took him to Asia in a way completely unlike his early cruises around the world. Here, audiences didn't just listen to music, they received it with a reverence that felt almost ceremonial. Don sensed his music, born in the gardens of British rock, reaching cultures far beyond its origins. And that realization deepened his understanding of the life force behind his craft. Amid this expanding horizon, an unseen blow pulled Don away from the spotlight. His son fell gravely ill, and everything stopped. Tours, projects, invitations, all faded against one undeniable truth. He needed to be home. Don stepped back, not because music lost its meaning, but because he understood that some moments in life outweigh any stage. He spent years beside his family, confronting challenges no musical technique could remedy. When his son eventually recovered, Don returned to music transformed. Deeper, more grateful, more aware of what every note meant. He arranged and conducted the orchestra for Love Shine a Light at Eurovision, a triumphant winning performance. But for Don, it was something else entirely. A reminder of the pure joy music could bring after years burdened by fear and uncertainty. Tours resumed, this time with a gentler pulse. With 10, a melodic rock band steeped in emotion, Don found a different energy. Not the wild intensity of his Ozzy years, not the intricate machinery of Rainbow, but something warm, cohesive, like walking a familiar road without having to outrun a storm. On stage, his Hammond no longer sounded like a declaration. It felt like a confession, the voice of someone who had climbed enough peaks and survived enough valleys to finally know where his heart belonged. Looking back, this was not Don's loudest era, nor his most glamorous, but it was the one that shaped him most profoundly. In his music, he expanded his borders. In his life, he faced a loss big enough to make every note afterward ring truer. Emerging from that quiet, but defining chapter, Don Airey was no longer just the reliable session player. He was a different kind of artist entirely, resilient, seasoned, real. By the end of the 1990s, Don's journey settled into a brief stillness, just long enough for fate to prepare the most important encounter of his musical life. That chapter closed without leaving Don with any urge to search for a new harbor. He had grown accustomed to living at crossroads, to hearing the call of different bands as though they were seasonal winds circling his life. A man who spent his youth moving from one world to another no longer trembled at the question of staying or leaving. But life always brings meetings that arrive at the wrong time, outside any plan, and only in hindsight do we realize every step had been guiding us there. Deep Purple entered Don Airey's story exactly like that. Quiet, unexpected, and, as time proved, as if the chapter had been written long before he ever read it. The band was facing an enormous void. John Lord, the soul of British Hammond, the architect of Purple's sound for more than 3 decades, was forced to step away from touring due to injury. They didn't need a temporary substitute. They needed someone who could preserve the breath of that legacy so the band wouldn't break its continuity. And they turned to Don. He joined Deep Purple in 2001, not as someone who had been chosen, but as someone who understood the weight of the seat he was taking. From the moment he laid his hands on the Hammond, he knew he wasn't touching an instrument. He was touching a living part of history that needed safeguarding. Don didn't try to become John Lord, nor did he attempt to change anything. He simply searched for the right heartbeat to keep the band standing through its most fragile transition. Those first shows carried a silence so distinct you could almost hear it. It wasn't the silence of anticipation. It was the unfinished breath of a family missing a familiar voice. Don filled that space not with flash, but with the experience earned from a life spent behind the spotlight. Under his hands, the Hammond roared when it needed to roar, and fell still when it needed to rest, like a new stream flowing into an old riverbed, transforming it without ever drowning it. The early years, with Deep Purple, were when Don found his place in a house he didn't build, yet one that welcomed him with complete trust. And it was there that he left the greatest mark of his career. From Bananas, 2003, to Rapture of the Deep, Now What, Infinite, and Whoosh. Don's music wasn't just notes. It was a new hue blending into Purple's classic palette. The classical breath of his childhood, the freedom of his wandering years, and the depth of someone who had played beside legends and lived long enough to see them leave. Purple's stage during those years had a strange atmosphere. Serenity inside an explosion. Don stood behind a fortress of keys, reaching up to his waist, his shoulders tilting slightly whenever the Hammond screamed the way he once said he would, only pass it on when the right person arrives. Some nights, the audience saw nothing but his silhouette dissolved into that signature purple glow, as if his entire being were dissolving into sound. No words were needed. Everyone felt that Deep Purple had found its new pulse. In interviews, when asked about replacing John Lord, Don always smiled. There is no replacing, only continuing. The line was not poetic, but it captured him fully. A man who spent a lifetime behind the lights, keeping rhythm so others could shine. And it was precisely that humility that brought Deep Purple its longest period of stability since the 1970s. Purple fans often say the Don Airey era is when the band found its breath again. Not because he replaced John Lord, no one could, but because he allowed the band to move forward without losing what made them legendary. In every album, every tour, every moment the Hammond trembled, listeners felt not absence, but evolution. Don was like the final keeper of the flame, feeding it just enough to burn, never enough to destroy what needed to remain. The longest years of his career were also when Don became most fully himself, no longer chasing someone else's music, no longer touring as a stand-in, no longer trapped inside bands in constant upheaval. Deep Purple gave him a home, and he returned to them an entire sonic universe no one else could have created. Don Airey spent the longest chapter of his professional life with Purple, a chapter where every note carried his childhood by the piano, his years on cruise ships, his nights beside legends, and the calm belonging only to someone who devoted his life to music. Deep Purple was not where he began, but it became the place where all his parts finally aligned. Experience, scars, endurance, loyalty. From here, the road ahead unfolded not through explosive twists as before, but through the quiet maturity of an artist who had found his natural pulse. And in that completeness, Don stepped into the pivotal late chapter of his life. A time when the vast sea of rock still called out to him. Yet he finally allowed himself to speak in his own voice. Solo albums, independent tours, and moments of recognition he once only dreamed of. From here, Don Airey's story moved into its 2010-2024 chapter. The era of an artist who was both the heartbeat of Deep Purple and the narrator of his own life through music that was seasoned, profound, and full of reflection. After 2010, Don's life changed tempo. No more aimless journeys, no more nights spent sleeping on the road. Music was no longer just the path he walked. It had become the place he returned to. Can you feel that silence? The silence that only comes after half a lifetime of noise. His second solo album, A Light in the Sky, marked a new chapter in a soul that had spent decades behind the spotlight. Gone were the shades of Hendrix, gone were the harmonies bound by the strict architecture of classic rock. The music here was wider, more abstract, as if Don were finally speaking to himself after years of playing for others. Every phrase carried the depth of age, yet moved with the freedom of someone who had crossed too many borders to fear anything anymore. When One of a Kind arrived in 2018, the world saw Don take a long step out of Purple's shadow. The album breathed the fire of old-school hard rock, but elevated by a level of technique and experience that could not be imitated. Don wasn't trying to prove he was a solo musician. He was opening the doors of his inner world, allowing listeners to realize that behind every chord he ever played was an entire galaxy of memory. The melodies felt familiar, yet more yearning, more emotional, as if written by someone who had lived long enough to understand that music is sometimes nothing more than a way to hold on to memory. Meanwhile, he continued crossing stages that seemed immune to time with Deep Purple. The band's music changed in an unusual way, not by being louder or abandoning its legacy, but by quietly expanding into wider, deeper landscapes. In every recording, listeners could hear a Purple that had matured, no longer chasing youth, but sharper in the way only those who have stood atop mountains and still have something left to say can be. Don stood at that intersection where the Hammond carried the breath of Mark II, while pushing Purple toward broader, more modern horizons. From Nashville studios to European stadiums, he was the thread stitching together a fiery past with a self-renewing present. During this era, Don received a rare honor, one that any classically trained musician would consider a lifetime achievement. He became a Steinway artist. When he entered the Hamburg Steinway workshop where pianos are crafted by hand, he played a short fugue on Smoke on the Water for the craftsman. That moment has since been retold as something uncanny. An artist standing before the instrument that had traveled beside him since childhood, both finally recognizing each other after decades apart. One artisan said the piano seemed to open its voice for him, and Don simply smiled, because he had always known pianos have souls, and they sing only for those they trust. The tours continued year after year. Deep Purple still sold out arenas across continents, even as original members retired or passed away. People said Don carried Purple through a period that would have caused many bands to collapse under the weight of change. But Don never claimed credit. He said he merely sat in an empty chair and played the best I could. That humility only endeared him more, not as a myth, but as a rare artist who remained untainted after 50 years inside rock's loudest machinery. His latest solo album, Pushed to the Edge, was born during the stillness of the pandemic. Alone with the sound of his own breathing, he wrote as though the world had vanished, and only music remained. The album wasn't sharp like Youth, nor stormy like K2. It was recollection set to sound, crafted by hands that had touched both the brightest lights and the darkest shadows. It didn't create media frenzy, but those who listened felt the weight of a soul that had given everything to its art. Deep Purple, meanwhile, continued what they jokingly and half ominously called the Long Goodbye Tour. Yet nothing about the atmosphere felt like an ending. Don stood behind his fortress of keys, hands moving lightly but firmly, opening sonic spaces that felt both new and familiar. Audiences changed with time, lineups shifted, but Don seemed untouched by it all, steady, calm, carrying the beauty of someone loyal to music long before loyalty belonged to anything else. By 2024, he had spent over 2 decades with Deep Purple while nurturing a steady solo career, a trajectory he once imagined would last only a few gigs. The recognition that mattered most didn't come from trophies or grand tributes, but from the listeners, those who heard the Hammond swell and understood that a band's soul sometimes belongs to the quietest person on stage. What Don gave British rock was never ostentatious. It lived quietly, just like him, in harmonies only fellow musicians could decipher. In recordings where nobody knew his name but instantly recognized his tone. In live shows where he kept an entire structure from collapsing with a single, silent act of timing. Through it all, the most enduring force was the way he worked. No spotlight, no demands, no scramble for titles. Don simply appeared when needed, sometimes only to fix a chord, adjust a transition, or rescue a concert with a few seconds of invisible steadiness. That repetition, decade after decade, became the reason musicians revered him. Absolute trust. Though Don Airey's career spanned countless bands, thousands of stages, and journeys across continents, his private world remained strangely small and peaceful. Among roaring crowds, he guarded a space only a few could enter, the home he shared with Doris, the woman who walked beside him through most of his long road. Their marriage was not tabloid fodder. It wasn't dramatic. It flowed like an underground stream beneath a landscape of constant movement. Audiences could see Don before tens of thousands, hands flying across the keys as if led by an unseen force. But only those close knew that when the tour ended, he returned not to the studio or stage, but to a small house in southwest Cambridgeshire, where Doris and their 3 children waited. For Don, family was never an accessory to his career. It was the anchor that kept him from being swept away. In a world where nights bled into days and flights erased geography, he held on to a simple ritual. Returning home, sitting at his familiar piano, letting sound drift through walls that had hurt his youth and watched his children grow. The piano was no longer his alone. It was the heart of the family. But family was not only a refuge from applause, it was where Don faced one of his private battles. In 1992, one of his children fell critically ill. Don quietly withdrew from music, canceling tours and turning down work, as if the world had shrunk to a single room where his child fought for each day. Few outside ever knew. Don never turned his pain into spectacle. But that silence revealed something truer than any interview could. For Don Airey, family wasn't a place to rest. It was the reason to keep moving. When his child recovered and life regained rhythm, Don returned to the road, carrying with him a calmness audiences could feel, the steadiness of someone who always had somewhere real to return to. He might vanish for days after a tour, not to escape, but to recalibrate, to become a father and husband again before once more becoming a musician. His brothers, Keith and Paul Airey, also pursued music, each in their own direction, forming a family where sound was the shared dialect. Yet Don never romanticized it, never turned it into mythology. Family was simply family, ordinary, quiet, held together by 1,000 small moments, like unobtrusive chords that keep the whole arrangement from falling apart. Perhaps that is what allowed Don Airey to keep something many artists lose, his own wholeness. After half a century under rock's brightest lights, watching friends fall, standing beside legends only to bury them later, Don remained intact. Not because he was stronger, but because he always had somewhere to put the chaos down. Family didn't make him famous, it kept him human. It didn't put his name in headlines. It kept his soul in the music. Across a 50-year career, that may be the greatest gift life gave him, and the foundation for every chapter still to come. Now, in his 70s, Don Airey lives a quieter life than the decades spent under stage lights. He still tours with Deep Purple on their remaining dates, still practices the piano at home, still enters the music room to check scales with the same care he had as a boy. The flights are fewer, the pace slower, but there is no sense of an ending. Don lives as though music still has things to say through his hands, only softer now, deeper, without urgency. In his small Cambridgeshire home, he spends time with Doris and the children, with the garden outside, with the piano that has accompanied almost every chapter of his life. He still performs special shows, still records, still composes, but all at the tempo of a man who finally knows what truly matters. Not fame, not records. Peace. Looking back on Don Airey's life is like replaying an old recording. The more you listen, the more layers appear, and you begin to understand why he is seen as one of the most steadfast timekeepers in British rock. He never sought the spotlight, yet somehow his music always bound other people together. Not everyone knows Don Airey's name, but anyone who has heard his Hammond recognizes the soul beneath his quiet presence. His life was never loud, but it was profoundly deep, humane, enduring, impossible to summarize. When this story ends, no one wonders where Don stands in rock history. They remember what he left inside them, the presence of a man who stepped behind the light so that the music could shine. Don Airey belongs to that rare breed, silent, unshakable, irreplaceable. The last note fades into a silence that feels like breath stretched across an entire life, where stories, losses, and kindness continue to echo long after the player has stepped from the stage. The hall empties, but every listener carries something home, a warmth that refuses to fade. In that silence, they understand. Music survives because someone keeps time for it in the shadows. Don's Hammond remains there, steady, glowing, like a flame tended by someone who never needed to be seen, only to let the music breathe. Do you remember the first time you heard Don Airey's Hammond in a rock song? Share that memory below. And don't forget to like and subscribe so we can keep preserving the music of Don Airey, the man who stepped back, so the music could move forward.